This is Sharath from the... but no such...
as the baptism
trains. Hello and welcome back to Curiosity Mine, and welcome to Sydney. For as long as Sydney's had people living in it, it's had people dying in it. And that's a problem, because when that happens, you really need to find somewhere to put them.
The first cemetery in Sydney, known simply as the Burial Ground, was located right in the middle of what is now the city, literally on or under the site of Sydney Town Hall, and not far from what is now Town Hall Railway Station. As time went on, Sydney grew, and people refused to stop dying rather rudely. So eventually the burial ground became full, and a new cemetery began at Brickfield Hill, which is the modern-day location of Central Railway Station. There's a real recurring theme of cemeteries and railway stations here. I'm kind of sensing foreshadowing or something.
This is Sharath from the YouTube channel Building Beautifully, your go-to YouTube destination from all things city planning, who's joined me for a day amongst the tombstones. If you enjoyed this video, you should absolutely go and check out Building Beautifully for videos about city planning, primarily in Sydney, infrastructure, public transport, and Denniston Station.
I agree. Come and check me out.
The old burial ground at Town Hall closed in 1820 and fell into complete disrepair after the new cemetery opened, and fell victim to trespassing, vandalism, grave robbery, and general debauchery. So it was eventually dug up, and it was demolished and made way for the Town Hall building itself. The majority of graves in the old cemetery were very poorly marked or totally unmarked, or record keeping was very poor. By the time the exhumation process of the old burial ground started in 1869, the new cemetery at Brickfield Hill was pretty much already full. Here's a delightful quote from the Church of England's Bishop Rawson, referring to the overpopulated new cemetery.
The Church of England burial ground is so completely occupied that decency and propriety are outraged, and it is impossible to find room for more bodies.
So the remains from the old Town Hall burial ground here bypassed the new cemetery at Brickfield Hill and were instead reinterred at a new cemetery that was consecrated further out to the west, in an area that at the time was considered to be far enough away from Sydney to satisfy Victorian superstitions about cleanliness and keeping death as far away as possible from where you live. The new cemetery was consecrated at an area called Haslam's Creek, about 16 kilometres to the west of the Sydney CBD. At the time, 16 kilometres seemed like a massive distance away, but little did they know that wasn't going to be the case for very long. The new cemetery was also massive, starting off at 80 hectares or 200 acres, which is about half the size of the Sydney CBD today. The area of the cemetery was so huge, it was referred to and later named the Necropolis, or quite literally, the City of the Dead. The cemetery was opened in 1867 as Haslam's Creek Cemetery, which really didn't go down well with the residents of Haslam's Creek, who now had a gigantic graveyard right on their doorstep. A graveyard that took up more land than the actual residential part of their suburb. It had the same name as their suburb, and it overshadowed the entire existence of their suburb. So in 1876, Haslam's Creek quietly detached itself from the burial ground, and the cemetery was renamed to the Rookwood Necropolis. The source of the name is disputed. Some claim it's borrowed from Rookwood Cemetery in London. Others claim the name came from the 1834 novel Rookwood by William Harrison Ainsworth. Regardless of how Rookwood Necropolis got its name, I think we can all agree it's pretty much the perfect name, and it absolutely suits the Victorian and Gothic revival architecture that's inextricably linked to cemeteries, and this one in particular.
So, when Haslam's Creek Cemetery was renamed to Rookwood Necropolis because the Haslam's Creek folk didn't like living in a cemetery, the name Rookwood actually applied not just to the cemetery, but to the area immediately around it.
So the cemetery was originally opened as Haslam's Creek Cemetery, which the people of Haslam's Creek hated. So they petitioned to have their suburb renamed to something else, so it became Rookwood. And within about 5 minutes, the cemetery was also renamed to Rookwood Necropolis. So the people of Rookwood then petitioned again to have it changed. But rather than changing the name of the suburb, the decision was made to effectively detach the residential part of Rookwood from the cemetery part of Rookwood and create a new suburb instead. And thus, Lidcombe was born.
To quote the Evening News,
The aldermen are pleased that they have succeeded in sinking into oblivion what has been termed the unsavoury title of Rookwood, and it is freely held that the move will at once make the locality a more popular one.
I'd also like to point out that the exciting new suburb of Lidcombe was named by combining the names of its current mayor, Frederick Lidbury, well, current at the time, and the name of the previous mayor, and at that time opponent in the mayoral election, Henry Larkham. Thus we have Lyd and Combe, which make Lidcombe. So Lidcombe is just two politicians Frankenstein together. They really doubled down on the beige there. Go Lidcombe. If you're curious, Henry Larkham and Frederick Lidbury are both probably buried in this cemetery somewhere. I say probably because locating information about who is and is not buried here is at best a chore and at worst a fool's errand, and sources get sketchier and sketchier the deeper you go into the rabbit hole. Henry Larkham's family were stonemasons, and they're responsible for a number of statues and headstones throughout this cemetery. In fact, Larkham Memorial still exists just across the road from the cemetery, although the business has since changed hands numerous times. Lidbury didn't have such an impact, but apparently he built and lived in a huge Gothic mansion just across the road from the cemetery, but I could find very little on where it was, or if it still exists. At least his choice of architectural style is appropriately themed to this story. With approximately 1 million people interred, Rookwood Necropolis is the largest cemetery in the Southern Hemisphere and probably the fourth largest cemetery in the world. The first burial was in January of 1867, and the cemetery has remained in constant use since. Among those buried at Rookwood are Emily and George Bradman, the parents of Sir Donald 99.94 Bradman, Peter Dodds McCormick, who wrote Advance Australia Fair. So I acknowledge that not everyone is in love with the Australian national anthem, but regardless of that, the bloke who wrote it is buried here at Rookwood Cemetery. And there's a nice little plaque from the 1988 Bicentennial Project commemorating the song that he wrote. Louisa Lawson, poet and author, women's suffrage pioneer and mother of Henry Lawson. If you're into Australian corporate history, we have David Jones of the department store, John Gowing of the department store, Anthony Horden of the department store, although you'll probably recognise his name from the Horden Pavilion. There's also a memorial to his son, Anthony Horden Jr., who died at sea off Western Australia on the SS Carthage. John Fairfax of Fairfax Media, James Toohey of the brewery, I feel like a Tooheys or two, and William Arnott of Arnott's Biscuits. They're all buried here somewhere, along with Jack Lang and Joseph Cahill, who are premiers of New South Wales, and a few others who you might recognise if you're into Sydney history and characters, but this video is already a fortnight long, so we won't go into detail. B. Miles, Andrew Torning, Isaac Nichols, David Scott Mitchell, May Kwong Tart and Roy Rene are here somewhere. For one more, we need to go all the way over to the northern wall of the cemetery. All right, hold on for a second while I digress down a completely tangential rabbit hole. Jacob Pitman, the brother of Isaac Pitman, who developed Pitman shorthand writing, is buried right here. If you're not familiar with shorthand, it's a form of very efficient writing where you write down only the sounds that make up words using these really quick little squiggles that you can later read back. It looks like this. Good luck figuring that out. And it was usually used for things like dictation and stenography and those sorts of tasks way back in the day. My grandmother was very skilled at Pitman shorthand.
You can do shorthand.
So? Prior to inventing his shorthand method, Isaac Pitman also recommended a proposed regime of English spelling reform and simplification, which ultimately led to the invention of his form of shorthand. He really hated the way English spelling and writing worked, and probably rightly so. So he made a valiant effort to change the world. And while the shorthand caught on, the spelling reform did not. But here's a delightful vestige of Pitman's proposed way of spelling things on his brother's tombstone, which is written in Isaac Pitman's phonetic version of English, which his brother, Jacob, buried here, tried really, really hard to make popular in Australia. It didn't work. In loving memory of Jacob Pitman, born 28th November 1810 at Trowbridge, England, settled in Adelaide 1838, died 12th March 1890, architect, introduced phonetic shorthand and was the first minister in these colonies of the doctrines of the second or new Christian church, which acknowledges, that one is my favourite, which acknowledges the Lord Jesus Christ in his divine humanity as the creator of the universe.
But the universe?
The Redeemer and Regenerator of men, God over all, blessed forever. I love it. It's fantastic. You should really come and visit this one. If you visit nothing else in the cemetery, check this grave out. This wouldn't be a Curiosity Mine video if we didn't somehow join the dots and link all of this back to the opal mining town of Lightning Ridge in northern New South Wales. If you're not familiar with Lightning Ridge, it's the home of the black opal. I grew up there. It's a fascinating place and it means a lot to me. Here is a playlist of all the videos that I've made about the town and the opal industry, opal, opalized fossils, so go nuts with those. Anyway, back in 2016, I made a video about one of the founders of the Lightning Ridge opal industry, Charles Waterhouse Nettleton. And in that video, Barbara from the Lightning Ridge Historical Society alluded to something that it's only taken me 8 years to follow up on.
Charlie Nettleton, a man born in Warrnambool in Victoria. He'd worked in White Cliffs. He knew the white opal, probably rode his bicycle to Wilcannia, came up the river to Burke, came across to Walgett, following the river and up to Lightning Ridge. He might have been looking for gold even, but was shown beautiful little black stones that had washed down from the ridge at the 6 Mile. Now today that's a historical reserve. It was created in 1989, and because we have our sculpture of Charlie, more and more people are going to visit this space, a beginning of our industry and of the very special black opal. Now Charlie lived here for 40 years in Lightning Ridge. He was going blind at the end of his life. He went down to the Balmain men's home in Sydney and was looked after. He died in the Lidcombe men's home and was buried at Rookwood in a pauper's grave. They wanted to exhume his body and bring it back to Lightning Ridge. There was talk of that over the decades. But when the time came to celebrate 100 years, which was 2003, we actually went to Rookwood and marked his grave.
Charlie Nettleton's grave is marked by a brass plaque that was erected in 2003 by the Lightning Ridge Historical Society, the Charlie Nettleton Fund and Dave Galman. Charlie's grave bears the inscription, "He was the first professional prospector on the opal fields at Lightning Ridge, New South Wales." This marker was placed in 2003 by the Friends of Lightning Ridge and of Black Opal. If you visit Lightning Ridge, and you should visit Lightning Ridge, I recommend visiting Charlie Nettleton's first shaft monument on the Green Car Door Tour. It's not Charlie's actual first shaft, because no one knows where that was precisely, but it's an old-fashioned rectangular mine shaft of the era, and it's in a beautiful location that's quite fitting to Charlie's story and his legacy. And you should also visit the 3 Mile Flat opal field, which is the location of the Nettleton settlement, and also the bronze statue of Charlie at the Lightning Ridge Historical Society's museum in Marilla Street. So somewhere in this general area is the grave of my great-great-grandfather, Frederick Gawthorpe. This is not his grave. We were never wealthy enough as a family to have anything like this as a gravestone. In fact, I suspect his grave is completely unmarked because I haven't been able to find anything with any indication of him on it. But also somewhere in this area, very close to my great-great-grandfather's grave, is his son's grave. His son was also Frederick Gawthorpe. He was Frederick Richard Gawthorpe, Frederick Gawthorpe II, Frederick Gawthorpe Jr., whatever you would like to call him. He was unfortunately killed at the age of 21 in a fairly horrific train accident at Hornsby. So that's interesting and a little bit sad, and yeah, interesting to stand in the presence of your ancestors. And quite some distance to the south is the grave of Frederick's wife, Elizabeth Mary Gawthorpe, my great-great-grandmother. It's kind of sobering to be near these two graves, even if I don't know exactly where they are. Just knowing that without these two people, 4 generations of my family would never have existed, and I wouldn't be here to tell you about this. Curiosity Mine is on Patreon. Patreon is a service that allows you to directly support your favourite creators to allow them to continue making the content that you enjoy. If you think that Curiosity Mine deserves it, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon, either at patreon.com/curiositymine or curiositymine.com/Patreon. Both of those work. You literally can't get it wrong. If you support the channel, you'll have my infinite appreciation, and you'll also get your name on this list of amazing people who are already supporting the channel. Also, you should absolutely go and subscribe to Building Beautifully on YouTube, your go-to YouTube destination for all things city planning. And if you like what you see, you should totally support Building Beautifully on Ko-fi as well. But let's get back to the cemetery because we've got a train to catch. Given that Rookwood is literally the size of a suburb, because it is a suburb, it should come as no surprise that it had a railway station at the very least. But it was the very least because Rookwood had its own railway line, 4 railway stations entirely of its own, and links to 2 mainline stations, all specifically for the purpose of moving the deceased and their mourners from the city to the cemetery and back. Well, back for the mourners. The mourners usually went back, the deceased would stay in the cemetery.
We start our journey near Central Station at Regent Street Station, formerly known simply as the Mortuary Station, or even better, the Necropolis Receiving Station, which is this spectacular Gothic-style building just off Regent Street, just south of the Sydney CBD. From 1869 to 1938, funeral trains would depart from here to Rookwood Cemetery, carrying those who had passed and those who would mourn them. The building was designed to look like a church, and even follow some pretty strict guidelines for church design and architecture. But it was never officially consecrated or converted into a church.
The station closed in 1938 due to a decline in service thanks to the advent and popularity of the motor car and by extension the motor hearse, which removed the need for funerary trains. In March of 1938 the station was renamed from Mortuary Station to Regent Street, and it started a long career of being used for all sorts of fairly weird things. First up, it was used for loading and unloading of racing dogs bound for dog tracks at Wollongong, Dapto, Gosford and Wyong. Some sources say that it was also used for loading horses, but I'm somewhat skeptical because this looks like a stupidly impractical building to use to load horses onto a train. And reason number 2, some sources, is Wikipedia. Citation needed for that one. In the 1950s, Regent Street was basically used as a glorified post office. It was also used for parcel dispatch and freight loading. In fact, they demolished an atrocious amount of the beautiful stonework to make way for additional overhead catenaries and other infrastructure to make the building into a more practical building for getting trains in and out and getting stuff in and out of said trains.
Since then, it's been restored at least somewhat and became heritage listed, but that hasn't prevented it from being occupied by some pretty strange things.
In 1986, the place was opened up as the Magic Mortuary, which was a pancake parlour on a train carriage, or rather, on train carriages.
In 1948, the station was closed down, and now 36 years later, it's not only been reopened, but it's been renamed the Magic Mortuary Station. But I'm yet to find out why.
There was a carriage for pancakes, a carriage for live entertainment, and a carriage for a gift shop. They also had a glass blowing display, because of course they did, and it lasted 3 years before closing down for reasons that I could not possibly imagine. The pancake parlour is honestly where it peaks though, since then it's been used as a unique venue for one-off events, which are often rare opportunities for the public to get access to the building. I guess the best part of Regent Street's story is that it's still here, because look at it. It's a spectacular thing.
So back when this was fully operational, you would start your funeral journey, or someone else's really, here. From the mortuary station, you would ride the funeral train down the main suburban line to Rookwood. From Regent Street Station, which is on the Darling Harbour Goods Line, you would join the main suburban at the Central Goods Junction, then head west towards someone's final resting place at Rookwood. Along the way, there were a few stations that had mourners' platforms, or at least mourners' sections of platform, including Newtown Station, which had an odd little Gothic shelter on one of its platforms, specifically for mourners.
Croydon and Stratfield also had facilities for mourners to join funeral trains.
A funeral train from Regent Street would head out on the main suburban line until you reach Rookwood Station, which we now call Lidcombe, at which point it turns back towards the city on the Rookwood Railway line, then veering off to the south, into the cemetery itself, and to the mortuary stations within it. Lidcombe has a long history of being a junction for weird little spur lines. It was the junction for the Rookwood Cemetery line, it was the junction for the Abattoirs line, and more recently it's the jumping off point for the Abattoirs line's modern configuration, which is the T7 Olympic Park line. For a station named after a suburb named after two politicians, it's trying very, very, very hard to almost be interesting. But back to the cemetery train.
Funeral trains ran twice a day on weekdays and once on weekends. The trains were usually 6-class with a hearse carriage attached to the back. More often than not, the carriages were rickety wooden red frame carriages with uncomfortable seats and a rough ride, which anecdotally helped to enhance the morose and depressing experience of attending a funeral. The hearse carriages were a specific type of carriage designed to carry about a dozen bodies. And off into the cemetery we go.
This is a map of Rookwood Necropolis, and this is the route of the railway through the cemetery. We'll start up here at station number 1, and we'll head all the way around here to station number 4. This is cemetery station number 1, or at least what's left of it. This station was opened in 1867 as Haslam's Creek Cemetery because literally everything has been named Haslam's Creek at some point. It was later renamed to Necropolis, then to Mortuary Terminus, then to Mortuary General Cemetery, and then to Cemetery Station number 1. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm willing to risk being wrong on the internet and say that I'm almost very entirely nearly certain that Cemetery Station number 1 is the most renamed railway station in Sydney railway history. If I'm wrong, it's what the comments are for. Go on. Do it.
Cemetery Station number 1 was a pretty spectacular building with buttresses and a bell tower, angel statues and 2 side platforms 175 metres long. The bell tower would ring out to announce to mourners that a funeral was in progress. As often seems to be the case with these types of structures, it ultimately fell into disrepair after the closure of the cemetery railway line, and was subject to vandalism and degeneracy as per the usual routine of abandoned infrastructure. A fire destroyed the wooden roof, someone stole the bell from the bell tower, and in 1952 the railway had had enough of trying to maintain it, or keep people out of it, or really do anything to prevent it from being a liability, so they sold it off for the grand sum of £100, or about $200. And all 782 tons of the building were dismantled brick by brick and relocated to Saintsley, Canberra, where it now stands as All Saints Church, which is why all we have left here is the building's foundation.
The most obvious difference is that the bell tower was relocated to the other side of the building for reasons unclear. Inside, the stolen bell was replaced with a bell from a Shay-geared steam locomotive, which is very fitting to the church's previous life as a railway station, and the baptism font is made from the chimney stone from the fireplace in the waiting room of station number 1 and station number 3, because the stone was moved between the 2 stations. It's a beautiful building with a really interesting story. One of my favourite design features on this building is just up here, because this building was built in 1868 for the first time at Rookwood Cemetery, but then it was relocated here in 1958 at Ainslie in Canberra. So it has 2 little detail bricks showing the years it was constructed. I love it. Even the building knows where it came from.
Hello? I can't believe it's just an entire train station just left here.
Pretty impressive.
I mean, not an entire train station, of course.
I'm glad they left ruins, because clearly they had the option to not. This could have just been a vacant space.
They could have put like more gravestones here, but they didn't. That's pretty cool. But yeah, you can see where the train tracks went through. So it's just one track.
I'm just impressed that they left the ruins. Like, this could have so easily just been a plaque on a rock saying this is where it was. It would have been fairly impressive. Like, it had a really high ceiling in it up here.
I know, I think it'd be nice if they preserved it, but also something kind of cool about seeing the ruins as well.
Yeah.
I feel like if they left it here, it would have just been vandalized non-stop. And it probably one way or another wouldn't be here anyway.
That certainly seemed to be the way that it was going.
And so the railway just kept going from here, right?
Yeah, it kept going, and then it would have gone out that way, and then gently curved around that way, and it would have basically done a huge loop, and then back around. Station 4 was over there, and it was basically excuse the pun, I'm sorry, it was a dead end, and the train would then have to come back all the way. Can't help myself, sorry.
Good.
This is what they pay me for. This just in, this plaque here is telling us that at some point there will be 2 columns bracing the northern end of this structure, so hopefully it won't just be a ruin with a few little concrete cubes forever.
That'll be good.
That's exciting.
Somewhere around here was Cemetery Station number 2, which was originally opened as the Roman Catholic platform, and has the very nerdy and unique claim of being the only one of the 4 cemetery stations to have never been the terminus of the line. Station 2 was actually opened after Station 3, which we'll get to in a moment. Cemetery Station number 2 had a single side platform that was 132 meters long and a small wooden shelter, and not a lot else to write home about. This is the location of the former Cemetery Station number 3, which was originally opened as mortuary, then mortuary terminus, then Cemetery Station number 3. The station also had a single side platform and a small shelter, but the shelter here was made from material from the waiting room from Cemetery Station number 1, which was dismantled and moved over here. This is where the chimney stone that ended up being repurposed as the baptism font in All Saints Church in Canberra came from, although it was originally part of Station 1.
And this is where Cemetery Station number 4 once stood, and to continue grasping at straws for nerdy facts about these stations, Cemetery Station number 4 is, or was, the only station in Rookwood Cemetery that did not have its name changed between opening as Cemetery Station number 4 and closing as Cemetery Station number 4. Cemetery Station number 4 had 2 refuge sidings to the north, over there, which allowed trains to park and swap around so that multiple trains were able to use Station 4 reasonably efficiently. This station had a single side platform like the other 2 smaller stations, and it had a small stone shelter on the platform. The death knell for the funeral train started to ring in the late 1920s as these newfangled motor car things started to become popular and trains stopped being the ideal method of getting people to a funeral. Over the next few decades, funeral train patronage plummeted and the line was eventually closed in 1948. There's still a tiny section of the Rookwood Cemetery line that exists just to the east of Lidcombe Station. This section was electrified back in 1939 as a space to stable electric trains. This section of track is still officially known as the Cemetery Line, but it only extends 179 metres from Lidcombe Station, which is just over there, somewhere behind that vine. From 1858 to 1876, Lidcombe Station was called Haslam's Creek Station before it was renamed to Rookwood, but only for a few years. When the cemetery came along, the people were displeased, so the area was renamed to Lidcombe and the station, which is down there, along with it. So during the period when Lidcombe Station was still called Haslam's Creek Station, there was another station just a stone's throw up the line towards Sydney that was called Necropolis, which, once the other Rookwood station was renamed to Lidcombe, was renamed to Rookwood. It's all very confusing, I know.
Rookwood Station was located here, between the Arthur Street overbridge and the Flemington West Junction. Unfortunately, there's really nothing left of Rookwood Station today, apart from the obvious station-sized gap between the tracks, where the single-sided north platform used to be. Rookwood had two single-sided platforms on the up and down suburban lines. It kind of looks like it might have had an island platform, but it didn't. The northern platform only faced onto the suburban line. The down line for the main south ran right behind it.
After the closure of the 4 cemetery stations within Rookwood Necropolis proper, Rookwood Station on the main line worked as a regular suburban station servicing the area, and the cemetery, allowing people to continue to access the location by train. What I find really interesting about this station is that Necropolis, later Rookwood Station on the main line, existed at the same time as the Rookwood Cemetery branch proper. But it didn't have access to the spur line into the cemetery. You still needed to travel further to Lidcombe, then called Rookwood, to reverse back onto the cemetery siding to access the mortuary stations inside the cemetery. The cemetery stations on the branch line were used exclusively for funeral services, and Necropolis or Rookwood Station on the main line would have served visitors to the cemetery only. I assume when the mainline station was still operational, there would have at least been a pedestrian entrance into the cemetery from the northern side, but no such entrances exist today. It's always fun to see the remnants of where a railway station used to be, and especially one on the main line like this one. Another interesting feature of the gardens at Rookwood Cemetery is the Serpentine Canal, which was built prior to 1890, likely around 1874, partly to capture a natural stream and guide it through the necropolis, and partly to function as drainage for the gardens. It feeds a number of ponds and water features. It's basically just a brick-lined drain, but the Victorian-era ingenuity that went into it, ensuring it would not collapse in on itself, is quite an engineering marvel. This is one of the more scenic areas where you can get a really good look at the Serpentine Canal. It's such a cool old piece of infrastructure. Love it. Also, if you're interested in plants and Victorian-era superstitions, most of the major plantings within the cemetery, especially within the old section of the cemetery, are based on Victorian-era notions about the purposes and functions of various plants and trees. Ivy, for example, is a symbol of remembrance. Rose gardens symbolise love. Pine trees are symbols of protection and immortality. Protection maybe, but I don't think the immortality part worked out for the people buried here. If you drive to Rookwood Cemetery, I recommend not parking underneath one of these trees because that's a pine cone. And there's a lot more connections and meanings behind the other plantings that have been used. It's not my thing, but it might be yours, in which case this might be the place to visit. So I really like spending time in cemeteries. I've mentioned before that I really recommend that when you go places you should visit cemeteries because I find them to be really fascinating places. One of the things I find fascinating about cemeteries is that they're like museums. A cemetery is a museum where every exhibit in the museum has its own curator. So there's a ton of history, it's all unique to the people that are buried in the cemetery. I find it really interesting. And another thing that I like about cemeteries is that cemeteries are overwhelmingly positive places. The argument can certainly be made that they're sad and morose places, absolutely, but I find them to be very positive places because what you see when you look around a cemetery is monuments to the things that people have achieved and monuments to the love of families for the people who have passed away, and monuments to people who other people want to be remembered. And I think that's pretty positive. I like it. It's cool. You should visit cemeteries. They're cool places to be. And speaking of, if you'd like to visit Rookwood Cemetery, it's a 20-minute walk from Lidcombe Railway Station. Unfortunately, the cemetery railway line is no longer extant. That would make it a lot easier and quicker to get in here, but you can still walk its route, and there is a significant monument built around the former foundations of Mortuary Receiving Station number 1. The 408 bus will also get you all the way to the former site of Mortuary Station number 4, right between the Anglican and Jewish sections of the cemetery. If you're in a car, you can drive into the cemetery via the main entrances. There is apparently ample parking within the cemetery, but Sydney's definition of ample may differ from your own. Seems to be plenty of parking though. I'd be inclined to think that given the size of the cemetery, the 20-minute walk from Lidcombe Railway Station is barely an inconvenience. So you should probably just catch a train. Besides, that's what this video is all about, trains in a cemetery. This video was made with the help of Sharath from Building Beautifully, with special thanks to Ross Jackson, Barbara Moritz and Shaun Galman. If you enjoyed this video, the first thing you should do is go and subscribe to Building Beautifully on YouTube, and then you should also think about maybe subscribing to Curiosity Mine as well. If you think this video really deserves it, then you might also consider supporting this channel on Patreon and Building Beautifully on Ko-fi. And thank you for watching.